I thought the documentary was fascinating and disturbing. I remember, and I think this is one of the things you guys that led you to make this documentary. A few years ago, the line on statins had become, the question in today's day and age is not so much why are you on a statin, but why aren't you on a statin? That they were being recommended for perfectly healthy people over age 50 who might get heart disease or clogged arteries at some point as almost like a preventative measure. And while the whole film is definitely not just about statins, that's where it starts. And it's very interesting. So let me kick it off by playing this soundbite of a guy who was your patient, right? Tony Royal, who did take a statin. He was in a position of having had a heart attack, so his case was more severe. But the question of why not take one was experienced by him, the answer, I should say, firsthand. Here's Tony, SOT30.
Massive aches in my legs. I had no energy, no libido. I just lost the will to live almost. I felt dreadful. And it was that point where I started to question what was going on. Either I was very sick with some other illness, or my heart was going downhill again, or it could be possibly the medication I've been put on.
One of the medications that Tony was on that he believed caused him quite significant side effects, such as muscle fatigue, erectile dysfunction, brain fog, really limited his quality of life for many, many months, was a statin drug.
So, Dr. Aseem, let's start there with statins and this problem overall.
Yeah, Megyn. So really interesting you started with that because, my journey as a practicing cardiologist, as a qualified doctor for well over 20 years, actually started towards the end of sort of 2009, 2010, when I really started to investigate why heart disease hadn't really come down in the way it was predicted to come down. By the end of the 20th century, it was predicted that heart disease would essentially be eradicated because of statins had come on the scene. And a lot of what happened around changes in guidelines on diet was based upon this, what we now know is a very flawed hypothesis about lowering cholesterol. So that's where I begun my journey, because I was seeing my patients come in, more stress on the system in the National Health Service, more people on suffering from chronic disease, but patients also reporting a lot of side effects from statins, where there was a discrepancy between what I was observing in terms of the frequency of these side effects and diagnosing it and what was in the published literature. So when I went on that journey, Megyn, basically I, came to the conclusion that this fear around cholesterol is grossly exaggerated to the extent where one could argue, and there's published evidence for this, that high cholesterol, so-called LDL, bad cholesterol, isn't really a significant risk factor for heart disease. But of course, that's where statins came in, because the thinking was if we lower LDL cholesterol, so-called bad cholesterol, with these statin drugs, which are, by the way, estimated to be prescribed, Megyn, to 1 billion people globally, certainly at least 200 million. And we think at least 30 million Americans are taking statins. It doesn't really have that much of an effect. So when you start looking at the actual data on statins, and there's a huge caveat here, by the way, because almost all of the data on statins comes from industry-sponsored drug trials that have never really been independently evaluated. And that's something, of course, that comes out in the film where myself and John Abramson from Harvard, trying to get access to the raw data so it gets investigated, is that even if you look at that data from the drug companies and break it down, the actual benefit of a statin for an individual over a 5-year period at low risk of heart disease, or certainly someone who hasn't had a heart attack, is about 1%, 1 in 100 chance of it preventing a non-fatal heart attack, a non-disabling stroke, without prolonging one's life. Now, Tony's case is really interesting, and he was quite an unusual patient because, as you already alluded to, he was somebody that had a heart attack. He was a Virgin Atlantic airline pilot. He was fit and active. He was following the dietary guidelines, low-fat guidelines, thought he was doing everything, healthy in a healthy way. And in early 50s, basically suffered a heart attack, couldn't fly anymore, went back to his previous job, which was a maths and physics teacher. So he's very good with numbers. And then he started to get debilitating side effects, about a year after, taking all these medications he's prescribed. Well, he suddenly felt unwell anyway, initially. Started looking at the drugs and the details and the benefits, etc. Thought there were side effects from the drugs, stopped his statin, felt a lot better, and at the same time change his lifestyle. And, Tony now is in a situation, this is quite unusual for a heart patient who's had a heart stent and a heart attack. He's now training for World Ironman, and he's 60 plus now, and he's off all his pills, Megyn. So
wow.
I'm not saying this is for everybody, but it's a great example of what can be achieved in healthcare if we actually give patients the right information, if we empower them on the benefits and harms of drugs in a way that is not through coercion, not through manipulation of drug industry who are there to basically, make money. And the reality is this: most people in the world, Megyn, taking statins are going to get no benefit whatsoever, and they don't even know it.
If high cholesterol, high LDLs doesn't cause a heart attack, and you potentially can see that number rise without freaking out, then what does cause a heart attack?
Yeah, great question. Before I answer that specifically, I said something interesting that I found myself and a number of international scientists in 2016 in BMJ. We actually looked at whether LDL cholesterol had a risk for heart disease in over 60s, partly because the original studies where cholesterol was exposed as a potential risk factor or as a major risk factor for heart disease. What wasn't publicized, Megyn, in those original studies from Framingham, Massachusetts, that started in 1948 and went on for decades, is that once people hit 50, as their cholesterol dropped, their death rates increased. And we thought, this is a bit unusual. Why is no one really talking about this? So we went back and looked at, up-to-date data. And what we found, one, was there was no association with LDL cholesterol and heart disease in over 60s. But the most interesting finding was the higher one's LDL in older population, the lower the risk of death statistically, right? So the question is, how is that possible? Well, one of the things that's been forgotten because of all this focus on heart disease and this flawed hypothesis is that cholesterol has a really important role in the immune system. Older people are more vulnerable to dying from infections. And there's also an association, I must stress that we don't know if it's causal, but there is an association with low cholesterol and cancer, which again is likely linked to the immune system. So that just to muddy the waters a bit further, that just lowering cholesterol for the sake of it may actually be harmful. It's not that it has no detrimental effect. Now, what is a risk factor, major risk factor for heart disease? It's a process in the body called insulin resistance. So it's essentially over time, your body becoming resistant to the hormone insulin. And that is driven essentially by food, diets that are high in starch and sugar, ultra-processed foods, being sedentary, and also to some degree chronic stress. And insulin itself, when it's raised chronically for a long period of time, or if you're eating a lot of junk food, it directly is toxic to the inner lining of the heart artery. So that's how it causes heart disease, and that's accepted in the literature. Why is it not well known or publicized? Because never been really an effective drug to tackle insulin resistance that has then been proven in trials to prevent heart attacks. And of course, there is no market for a healthy lifestyle, really, for just eating real food,
no one gets rich off that.
Absolutely. So that's really the missing link. And when I institute this plan with my patients, Megyn, the lifestyle plan based upon the best evidence, and I don't say to my patients, don't take statins. I say, listen, this is the absolute benefit, without even talking about harms. I mean, harms come in as well in terms of quality of life limiting side effects, in particular, like muscle fatigue, like what Tony Roll experienced. Most patients, when given that 1% figure, Megyn, don't want to take the pill. And I actually write my letter back to their general practitioner and say, listen, the patient has decided they don't want to take the statin. I've given them the information, and their decision should be supported in keeping with the principles of ethical, evidence-based medical practice. So actually what the statin issue highlights is that if we were practicing true ethical, evidence-based medicine in healthcare, Megyn, we'd sort out the health crisis very, very quickly.
How would you see, so I think the way a lot of people see heart disease is you go to your cardiologist and maybe they give you an echocardiogram stress test combo where they can see your heart and how it handles stress. And they'll see whether you have a thickening of the walls of your arteries. That's the gold standard test, I think, other than getting that, I guess, calcium score read with injectable dye, which is more invasive. Yeah. But so if you see fatty buildup on the walls of your arteries, then you have a mystery to solve, right? And today, I think the doctor would say, if you had it, don't eat so much red meat. Don't eat fried food. Exercise more, right? What would you say if you saw that?
Yeah. So on the red meat issue, first of all, just for full disclosure here, Megyn, in 2013, I caused global controversy when I wrote in the BMJ, but formerly the British Medical Journal, that the saturated fat does not cause heart disease. And that's the evidence for that is now pretty much conclusive. So that means that eating foods like red meat does not contribute to heart disease at all. In fact, I tell my patients, I'm not worried about how much red meat you consume as long as you're following the principles of what I call a low refined carbohydrate Mediterranean diet. So that is definitely not something that I recommend patients to not do, right? Eating red meat is not an issue when it comes to heart disease. And, even on the issues of, say, colon cancer, the evidence is only really there for processed meat, not really for red meat, for real food. And the dietary guidelines, unfortunately, in the US and in the UK have really put at the base to tell people to eat, 6 to 11 servings, I think, in the US guidelines of starchy foods, which is the complete opposite of the foods that you want to. Oh, it is absolutely insane, because these are the foods that are going to drive all these conditions. It's not just about heart disease, it's high blood pressure, which is the single biggest risk factor for death globally. It's type 2 diabetes. They all contribute to also, it's not about longevity, it's about quality of life as well. If you've got type 2 diabetes, you're massively increased risk of depression, chronic pain, for example. And then, of course, you've got the pills to take, which aren't that effective, by the way, that give you side effects. So a whole management, really, of people's health in healthcare is upside down.
For those of us who have been holding our breath for the past several months, waiting for this election, we can finally exhale. Work can now be done on the major issues this country's facing, one of the most significant being our national debt. The fact is our nation's broke, and that debt is a house of cards that cannot be quickly dismantled. So the strategy for you probably remains the same when it comes to your investments. You might want to diversify your savings. This is why I want to tell you about Birch Gold. So many things are out of our control, out of our president's control. So it can be important to have a safe haven for your savings. Birch Gold Group can help you convert an IRA or 401k into an IRA in physical gold. And the best news is it does not cost you 1 cent out of pocket. Text MK to 989898 to get your free info kit on gold. Plus, right now you will receive a free 1-ounce silver eagle for every $5,000 purchased. Protect your savings with Birch Gold and text MK to 989898 to claim your eligibility for free silver today. Thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.